Hello, my name is Matthew Murphy, graduate student at Southern New Hampshire University. Today's presentation will be on the Cuban Missile Crisis and the current threat of nuclear war with North Korea. The Cuban Missile Crisis lasted from October 16th to October 28th in 1962. This was the closest that the world has ever come to full-out nuclear war. The main conflict was between Russia and the United States. Russia wanted to arm Cuba with nuclear weapons. And once the Americans found out via a U-2 spy plane, a intense standoff happened between the two nations. Ultimately, Russia did agree to take the nuclear weapons out of Cuba. In return, the United States agreed to not invade Cuba in the future. That was the public agreement. In secret, the United States also agreed to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey that threatened the Soviet Union at the time. The major players of the Cuban Missile Crisis were President Dwight D. Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and Nikita Khrushchev. President Eisenhower set the plans for the Bay of Pigs invasion, which ultimately led to the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster. It exposed the United States as wanting to invade in Cuba, which gave Nikita Khrushchev reason to arm Cuba and defend Cuba. President Kennedy was the one that green-lighted the Bay of Pigs, but the plan was implemented during the Eisenhower administration. Nikita Khrushchev was the premier for Russia from 1956 to 1964. In regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the major mistake Nikita Khrushchev made was secretly deploying the arms to Cuba in the first place. He did so starting in 1961 and actually denied the fact that he was arming Cuba when directly confronted by the United States about it. And historians have argued that this is his major mistake in the Cuban Missile Crisis, is his secrecy. If he had been more upfront about wanting to arm Cuba and arming Cuba, it could have turned out a lot different. Kennedy would have had a lot less legs to stand on in his negotiations in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The secrecy and the denial really showed that Nikita Khrushchev was in the wrong, or at least it appeared that Nikita Khrushchev was in the wrong in trying to arm Cuba. Let's fast forward now to 2017. We're talking about North Korea and the United States, the nuclear conflict that's going on right now between us and North Korea. The major players for the United States, President Obama from 2008 implemented the strategy of strategic patience. So we've imposed sanctions as North Korea has ramped up its nuclear efforts. North Korea first implemented their nuclear missile tests in 1993. Since then, they have also tested nuclear missiles in 2006, in 2009, 2013, 2014, and most recently in 2017. So with every new missile test, President Obama implemented more sanctions, and he kind of did not increase his rhetoric. He was very similar in Eisenhower, that he wanted to stabilize the situation, not increase it by threatening North Korea violently. This policy has changed when President Trump came into power. Most recently, he stated that if North Korea were to continue its aggressive policies toward America, it would be met with fire and fury that the world has never seen before. Obviously, a direct contrast from President Obama's tactics of strategic patience. Domestically, President Trump and Kennedy were not similar in any regard, but in regards to nuclear threat, they were actually very similar. Both had previous presidents that issued stabilization, and they came in and increased rhetoric. When Kennedy took office, he exposed the world to the imbalance of power of nuclear weapons. He stated that the United States had a nuclear arsenal that greatly outnumbered the nuclear arsenal from the Soviet Union. Eisenhower knew this but didn't make it public. Kennedy increased the rhetoric against the Soviet Union in that regard. President Trump is now doing the same thing against North Korea in regards to increasing the rhetoric and showing how, or telling North Korea how much more powerful the United States is than them. The leader of North Korea is Kim Jong-un. He took over from Kim Jong-il in 2011 after the death of his father. We weren't really sure what was going to happen with Kim Jong-un, if he was going to continue policies, if he was going to kind of change the policies and get North Korea more engaged in international discussions and international trade. He has not done that. He's actually increased the humanitarian crisis there, and he's increased the nuclear development in North Korea as well. So he's taken what his father had started and actually ramped it up more aggressively. Comparing Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, to Nikita Khrushchev, we can see some key differences and similarities. The major difference of Kim Jong-un to Khrushchev is the attitude towards fear. Kim Jong-un rules his country with fear, while Khrushchev wanted to de-Stalinize the country of the Soviet Union and wanted to reduce the amount of fear within the Russian government, within the Russian people, and within the world looking at the Soviet Union. He didn't want the world to look at Soviet Union with fear. That was his major accomplishment, according to his own memoirs. The similarities between the two: very erratic leaders, leaders that exaggerated greatly on what their strength was, and they both made threats against the United States to use nuclear weapons. Threat being the key word there, obviously. Overall, comparing the Cuban Missile Crisis to North Korea, the main difference that we see is the legitimacy of North Korea versus the legitimacy of the Soviet Union. The article, the link there that you can go to, is a link for the South China Morning Press. This article is titled Trump's Nuclear Standoff with North Korea, Why This Is No Cuban Missile Crisis. The main argument in this article is that North Korea is in no way as powerful as the Soviet Union was during the Cuban Missile Crisis, that threat was real, and that this threat is not as real. And I tend to agree with that argument. The similarities between the two, between the Cuban Missile Crisis and North Korea, is that there is a threat of nuclear war, even though it is much less than what the threat was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. There is a threat, and it still needs to be dealt with. And in the next slide, I'm going to go into a little bit of what history can tell us about moving forward in that. And then the tangled alliances, the similarities between the Cuban Missile Crisis and North Korea is that both North Korea and Cuba were relatively small countries in terms of size and power, but they were backed by much larger nations with real power. The Soviet Union obviously backing Cuba, and China backing North Korea in today's world. The main difference between that is that China has not agreed to aid Korea in any way with their nuclear capabilities. They do provide economic support and a lifeline against the sanctions that are imposed, but they are in no way organizing the nuclear threat against the United States. In relationship to the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union was directly arming Cuba. It was the Soviet Union plan to arm Cuba. They were Soviet missiles, and it was the Soviets, the one that were taking the lead in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which made the threat a lot more real. So, what is next to come? Obviously, historians cannot predict the future, but we can offer suggestions from history on how to guide policy and different things in that regard. So, in relationship to the Cuban Missile Crisis versus North Korea, we can see that tensions were greatly increased between the Soviet Union and the United States when Kennedy took office and started to increase his rhetoric. The tension increased, and that's why we got to the point where we did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it was the greatest threat that the world's ever seen for nuclear war, was because the two sides had increased their rhetoric. So that's very important to remember, that when communications break down between two countries, the only way that those countries communicate is through the media, is through public statements. There are no ambassadors, there's no direct line of communication. So that's very important to remember, that the rhetoric is the communication between the two countries. And lastly, that if direct action is taken against North Korea, we need to learn from the lessons in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that is that nation building is very hard. So if we do decide to remove the regime in North Korea, which the United States military definitely has the capability to do, we need to make sure that we know what's coming next, and we need to understand that building a nation, building a new government in a foreign territory is hard, long work. So I hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And thank you very much for your time.